I was asked by the Czech Greenkeepers Association to present a number of talks at their winter greenkeeping seminars in December 2019. And one subject they asked me to talk about was basically about my own career. So I thought I'd take the opportunity then to have a look at how greenkeeping and turfgrass management, what it was like in the 1980s, and how things changed and developed over the years. So basically that's what this talk is about today. So I started off just by reminding them that I actually had been a greenkeeper since the early 80s, a course manager of the Royal Curragh in Ireland since 1993, but since June of 2019 I'm a fully independent researcher now into turfgrass disease and physiology. So I gave a background to the area where the Royal Curragh Golf Club was established. It's called the Curragh, and it's probably one of the oldest and most extensive tracts of open grassland in Europe. And it's existed as an open grassland for well over 2,000 years. A lot of history in the area. For example, myself and my father-in-law, who was also a greenkeeper, were digging some drainage back in the 1980s on the golf course, and we found these two stones which seemed to fit together. And when they were examined by the National Museum, it turns out they were well over 5,500 years old. And they were what's called a saddle and quern stone used to grind corn. So this gives the evidence that the area has been well used and inhabited for many, many years. Some more recent history was that, as I said, the area was a grazed grassland for thousands of years. And in the 1850s, when the Scottish regiments of the British Army established a camp on the Curragh, they found this area of tightly mown grass by the sheep, and this is how they came to establish the golf course. And in this photo here you can see where they established their first tents. This hill here and the area of stables you can see were extending across where the golf course is today. And if you look back from the back of the first green here up the hill, you can still see today these circular indentations in the hillside where these first tents were established. More recent history. I say recent, you're talking about 1915 here. This is our fifth and sixth holes, and these are trenches which were put in 1915, and this is where the young recruits from the nearby army camp trained before they were sent to the battlefields in France for the First World War. As I said, the Curragh is one of the oldest, most extensive tracts of semi-natural grasslands in Europe, grazed by sheep, which of course contributed to the establishment of the golf course, but unfortunately the sheep grazing also gave rise to a lot of problems over the years. So much so that as part of one of my degree programs I did an assignment on the implications of sheep grazing on a golf course and the drawbacks therein. For example, this may look like a disease or some sort of a patch disease. In fact, it's from the urine of sheep, which scorches and kills off the grass. And you can see it here on a wider area of one of the fairways back in 2004. There's also the problem that sheep during the winter months are actually fed. And again, as you can see in this photo, this leads to a concentration of sheep in small areas. It attracts in things like flocks of crows, and also what sheep eat has to pass through. So the organic matter output is a major problem on a golf course. The course has to be cleaned up after it. And of course the organic matter can also increase things like worm casting and weed infestation. Just an example here of the sort of a mess that large concentrations of sheep can actually make on a golf course. Again, another example here, you can see the increase in worm casting and from the feeding and the organic output from sheep. Again, the Curragh, like I said, was an open grassland, and it wasn't fenced until about 2010. So it was wide open, and this gave rise to a lot of damage from vandals and that, as you can see in these photos. As you can see on the right, that particular green there, the 8th, was very near a road. So damage like this often occurred from vehicles coming in and doing wheelies and whatever. Again, this was our practice putting green. Although there is a fence to the outside here, it's still very accessible from the road to the left. And this was done in 2004. Again, just another view of the same damage. Totally, the entire green was beyond repair and had to be totally rebuilt. So that was just sort of a background to the area that I was working in. But the main talk today is going to be about things like how I started in greenkeeping, what turfgrass management was like in the 1980s, and how things have changed over the years. Obviously we have better equipment, better products, but we also have increased challenges now with things like chemical restrictions, environmental issues, and of course climate change. But one thing that I think made a huge difference over the years is education. And we're going to talk about or look at the road to education, what's available these days, and the impacts it can have on your career and how people view you and how you manage golf courses. I'm going to mention some of the pathways that are currently available. So, what was golf course maintenance like in Ireland and probably the UK back in the last century? Well, here's a clue, okay? When I first walked onto a golf green in the early 80s, I remember thinking this, how nice and soft this is. It's like walking on a mattress. So the level of thatch was quite intense, I have to say. Things like aeration and top dressing were not very commonplace in Ireland in the early 80s. Nice levels of thatch on the particular greens I was working with anyway. Why was that? Well, you know, I have to thank Brian Dunn from Adair Manor for some of these photos here. The equipment levels were quite old now and low, not quite as old as this, or in fact as these here, but we were fairly restricted with the levels of equipment that we had. Turf management operations were pretty basic in the early 80s. An example would be, you know, this slitter here on the right. If the greens were lucky, they would have got 1 or 2 runs of that in the year. I mentioned top dressing earlier on. Top dressing, on the advice of our agronomist at the time, was actually screened topsoil, which was basically fine clay particles spread over the surface of natural soil-based greens. I also mentioned low inputs. This was mostly to do with cultural practices, and it was true except for the case of inputs of nitrogen. Okay, so we had POA dominated greens, push-up greens in Ireland's temperate climate, and the nitrogen inputs per annum were 450 kgs per hectare per year. So like, it's no wonder these greens were so soft and spongy. So that was the very early 80s. For us, course upkeep consisted mostly of just mowing greens, though we actually had a ride-on Toro mower, cleaning up after the sheep, their organic output. We had one tractor, Massey Ferguson, and a gang mower, and this was used to cut the grass and daisies on the fairways. Another thing we did have was washing up liquid if we ever had some localized dry spot. But for the rest of the thing, the rough and semi-roughs and whatever were actually maintained by the sheep. So by the start of the 90s, the late 80s and early 90s, things began to change. We actually started to educate ourselves. We were reading up on techniques. We did greenkeeping courses. So this is when I started my first path to education. It was 1990. The Sports Turf Management Certificate course from the City and Guilds, and this was in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. We also at that time purchased a Cushman, so things were starting to look up a little bit. Along with the Cushman we had some tools, so we could actually begin to aerate regularly, and we also could top dress, not with the surface sealing clay, but with wash sand of the correct particle size and distribution. This was a slitter which we purchased with the Cushman, so regular slitting of greens became a feature of our maintenance program. This here always reminded me of an old World War II mine which we see in the films. It actually was a hollow core which fitted to the back of the Cushman. The cores were collected in the drum, as you can see, and that was then, you could actually recycle them or dump them. The only drawback with this was that the tines, as you can see, were at a maximum 2 inches depth. So early 90s, we began to adjust our nutritional inputs, cutting back on the nitrogen, doing some soil tests. Our greens then began to firm up and began to play really well. Not that well now, but quite well. So that was the 1990s. Into the 2000s, we were starting to get our act together. We had good products coming through. Some of them even had research, in fact, to support them. Machines were starting to improve, and we were getting our hands on some better levels of equipment. Management practices also changed. So these new products and maintenance techniques really made a big impact during this time. The courses began to shape up and began to have the look of a modern golf course. So what has made the biggest impact on course maintenance over the 80s and 90s into the 2000s? For me, certainly equipment wise, the things that made the biggest changes were things like ride-on mowers. I don't mean just for the greens, but for fairways, for tees, the approaches. This allowed much higher levels of maintenance and mowing and presentation. Vertidrains made a huge impact on course aeration. Things like the Procore type aerators which came in were a huge improvement on the older tractor mounted aerators. Top dressers. Spinning disc top dressers which replaced using shovels was probably the biggest impact for me. We were able now to go out, get good even levels of sand regularly onto our greens and playing surfaces. And of course integrated sprayers which replaced agricultural type sprayers on the back of tractors. Again, with foliar inputs, this was a crucial development. So apart from equipment, product wise, I would think foliar fertilizers, which allowed very So as we move into the 21st century, what I found certainly was that golfer expectations increased. They wanted very good playing surfaces, not just in the summer, but year round. And they wanted good presentations as well. So we had the Augusta effect, again almost year round. And for greenkeepers, that meant increased workloads. Again, one thing that I have found over the years is that there's always new challenges we have to face up to and deal with. Today, as we head into 2020, apart from dealing with the old usual problems such as maintaining quality playing surfaces, there's plenty of new problems which we have to face up to. Things like restrictions on plant protectants. So our fungicides were going, we have restrictions coming in on herbicides, things like insecticides were also restricted. We also have environmental issues. Now, back in the 80s, the environmental issues were there, but we just didn't recognize them. Certainly today, we have a much better understanding, and we're no longer are we just greenkeepers, but we're guardians of the environments that we're working in. We also have climate change. Things are changing, and this is another area that causes problems for us. Increased storms, increased rainfall, maybe increased droughts in the summer. More extreme weather is what we're facing up to. And something that really has come to the fore in the last couple of years also is that these work pressures of this lifestyle of ground staff and greenkeeping has very serious problems on our well-being and family life. And this again has to be faced up to. And many people in the industry now are talking about this and communicating on it, and this is really good. So, what has made the biggest impact on course maintenance over the years? Like, we have mentioned the different products and machinery, but one thing I have to mention, of course, is education. So, I wrote about this a couple of years back for a golf course industry magazine, and sort of the title was called "Anyone Can Cut Grass." And basically what I was saying was, what exactly does a turfgrass manager do? So I pointed out that a groundsperson, greenkeeper, is fully responsible for the maintenance and upkeep and presentation of a multi-million euro or pound asset. Now, you could be a golf course manager in Ireland, you could be looking after a soccer stadium in Prague, cricket grounds in England, rugby grounds in Australia, or the Olympic venues, which was in Brazil the year I wrote this. But the thing is, science is required to produce quality sports services. And these services are used by many millions of people, either as spectators or participants. So what I pointed out in the magazine article was that groundspeople and greenkeepers, they have to understand things like plant biology and physiology. You have to know about soil science, turfgrass species, cultivation and construction practices. You have to certainly understand drainage and irrigation. You have to look at machinery management. And a very tricky one, of course, is personnel management. And of course, my favourite was pests and diseases. So all these branches of science, you have to have an understanding of these. So where do you start with education? Well, I might have mentioned earlier that I started with a certificate course in sports turf management. This was a City and Guilds one, which I did at the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. I then, in the 2000s, moved on to a foundation degree in sports turf science. I moved on then to a Bachelor of Science and Honours degree in turfgrass science. Now from there, you can actually go on and do a master's in whatever subject you think is relevant. For me, I moved on from the honours degree straight into a PhD or a doctorate in plant pathology. So one thing I will have to say is that from the 2000s, online courses became available, and this had a very significant impact on education. Because if you're working full-time managing a golf course, you just don't have the time or the availability to attend college full-time. You have to support your family, you have to pay your mortgage. So the online availability became a real deal breaker. It became very important for many in education. And there's things like, Penn State was always almost the apex of turfgrass education going back for many years. And this now has become available online to anyone in the world. So you can actually do your certificate and degree programs with Penn State online, for example. For me, I did my degrees in Myerscough College in the UK, which was part of the University of Central Lancashire. And you can do things from certificates in sports turf part-time. You can look at foundation degrees in sports turf management. You can go on to honours degrees in turfgrass and sports turf sciences. These are all available online part-time. For example, the foundation degree is what I did, and this was over 3 years. And it gave a very good grounding and understanding of the basics and some more advanced knowledge into sports turf management. The honours degree is another step up where you get very involved in the technicalities and academic processes and the science of turfgrass management. This can be done either as 3 years or 4 years part-time, or you can top up from the foundation degree, and that would take 2 years. Again, available online and part-time. So for me, I did my honours degree in Microscope part-time while I was still working at the golf course. And one aspect of this was in the final year, you do a research project. I did mine on the effects of phosphate on the growth and disease susceptibility of Agrostis stolonifera. A very interesting project. I really opened my eyes to what's available and what you can do in academia. So I had to do things like grow grass in greenhouses, these tubes. Again, we grew them on, and I had to figure out things like, how do you cut the grass? How do you collect the cuttings so you can dry them and weigh them, for example? And I did things like I tried electric hair cutters, which didn't actually work too well. I tried shears. Again, it was okay, but difficult to collect the cuttings. So what I found was the best method, in fact, for this particular area was to use the scissors. And this way I could maintain my samples at a certain height and also collect the cuttings for various analyses. Again, with that particular final year subject, looking at phosphate and microdocium suppression, we got some really interesting results. So much so that the college entered these, and we were accepted to present the findings and the research at the European Turfgrass Society in France in 2010. So that was very interesting for me to get out there and talk about something that I had done for the past year. We got good results, as you can see in these comparisons here. And that research and the presentation of it to maybe 200 to 300 people of turfgrass scientists and peers really spurred me on then to do my doctorate, a PhD. And I did that eventually starting at the University of the West of England in Bristol. And again, this was a research PhD. I was basing it on suppression of Microdocium nivae by phosphate in cool season turfgrasses. So what exactly was involved in this? Well, I needed to see whether phosphate could actually suppress microdocium. I also had to figure out the means of suppression if there was any. And I also had to determine at phosphate any other effects, be it detrimental or beneficial on turfgrass growth. So for all this, we had to carry out a whole range of field trials and laboratory studies. So what exactly is involved in doing a PhD? What are we to do? Well, here's a sort of a descriptor from the University of West of England. And just to cut it short, basically you have to conduct research leading to the creation and interpretation of new knowledge. So you have to produce something research-wise that hasn't been done before. And you also have to show that you have an understanding of the current state of knowledge in that particular field. And you have to be able to conceptualize and describe and implement a project for the generation of new knowledge. You also have to understand that you have to demonstrate that you can present your findings. So doing a PhD is not just research. You're also getting a whole range of add-on skills, this transferable skills in how to carry out research, how to present yourself, how to talk to various different audiences as well, and present your findings. So what we had to do for this, one thing we did, for example, was a whole range of field trials over 4 years. We also then had to figure out how this particular phosphate was actually suppressing the disease, and we had to look at things like how it affected the pathogen itself, how it stimulated plant defense mechanisms. So we carried out laboratory studies like how phosphate actually suppressed the growth of the fungus in the laboratory in vitro. We also had to look at the infection process of microdocium in turfgrasses, again using a whole range of pot samples and infected greens, and techniques such as fluorescence microscopy. We had to look at how the infected plants responded with a range of defense mechanisms to see could we actually enhance these defenses. And again, I had to develop skills such as using various extraction processes and measurements to actually measure things like phenolic compounds in plants, and using visualization techniques using fluorescence microscopy. And we also then had to look at how phosphate was taken up into plant. And again, we use a new process here called high performance ion chromatography. So this was a method we developed which actually could separate and measure in the plant to separate phosphate from phosphate ions. And from that we could see how when phosphate was applied to the leaf, how it actually translocated through the plant, how it was taken up and how long it lasted in the plant. That's just a graph here showing that at day 0 how fast it was taken into the plant and how over 6 weeks it gradually was depleted. Again, that's just another same graph, same technique, but at a different time of the year, showing that phosphate is taken up rapidly but is much more rapidly depleted during times of higher growth. We also had to look at the effects phosphate had as a nutrient or a biostimulant, and whether phosphate could actually provide phosphorus nutrition. So we had to devise an experiment to see how phosphate affected the growth of plants and whether it could provide phosphorus nutrition. And for that we grew plants in 2 separate root zones. One, we actually grew Lolium perenne and Pro annua, 2 root zones. One was sufficient in phosphorus and the other was deficient. And we applied treatments and we assessed the effect phosphate and phosphate had on the growth. And we got some pretty good results there too, finding that phosphate in fact can have in a low P situation, phosphate has a deleterious effect on growth, whereas the control plant actually grew better. Again, what we found was that in P deficient root zones, foliar applied phosphate does not supply a usable form of phosphorus and represses deficiency responses. But what we did find also was that in the P sufficient root zone, phosphate increased biomass in all plants, so it increased the growth of the roots, crowns and leaf. So that was an interesting part of our research for the PhD. Just a photo there showing some of our trial sample pots in the greenhouse. So when you have all your research carried out, what you have to do then is produce a thesis. And mine was in total 400 pages. And not only that, it was 2 volumes. The main volume had about 300 pages in it, and there was a separate volume, an appendix showing all these statistical analyses that were carried out. And what else do you have to do? Well, it's encouraged that you actually publish papers in peer-reviewed journals. So far we have a couple published in plant science and plant pathology. You also, during the course of your PhD, have to carry out what's called research training and professional development. And you have to produce a document, again separate from the thesis, which covers all the various seminars and courses you have attended. You also have to show that you have presented your research. So you have to show how you've communicated, what conferences you've actually spoken at, and what papers and what publications you've written. So that's quite a long document. I think it's about 40 pages as well, documenting all your activities, not only your communications, but whatever modules you have to attend as part of the course also. So there's certain challenges when you're doing a PhD part-time and also managing a golf course. For example, time. You can't just take off a couple of months when you're managing a golf course to attend university. So that has to be very carefully managed. Laboratory work was tricky. Again, like I said, you can't take a few months to do laboratory work. And one way that I found around this was in fact to equip a laboratory at home where I could carry out some of the research, this was very instrumental in producing my research, in fact, and very handy. So, you can obtain various pieces of equipment, stock up your laboratory and work away at home in the evenings after working at your golf course. Classroom modules are a key part of a PhD. And again, with the advent of online technology, I could actually attend various classes at home. They could see me and I could see them. They could hear me and I could see them. So this was very advantageous as well. So one thing that you would miss actually though was the interaction with other students and faculty staff. So in a normal situation where you're attending university, you could be having coffee in the mornings, you could be talking about your research and problems and that. So when you're working away from the university, this is a problem. So some of the things that you have to do for us, for example, you have to do things like travel to the university, maybe with 120 pots of grass in the boot of your car. So you go over on the ferry from Ireland, travel down through England and get the grass in the greenhouse and laboratories in the university. That wasn't too bad. But then, like I said, we have a laboratory at home. So sometimes you'll be bringing back stocks of various chemicals. So bringing back little plastic bags of white powder could be quite tricky. You have to figure out various laboratory processes, especially when you're away from the university and you have no one to talk to. So what I found was that YouTube extremely very handy for this. You can find almost any process, or any laboratory process. I found out things like using a spectrophotometer, pipettes. You can also use it to access tutorials on statistical analysis, for example. So YouTube is a vital commodity in this day and age. We also had problems as well. For example, collecting and drying grass and grinding it up for process so that we could actually extract various chemicals. So you have to try and figure out ways to do that as well. You have to grow a microdocium around the house in the dark. So, you could open a drawer somewhere in one of our rooms and all these plates of fungus would be growing there. But the home lab came in very handy, I have to say. And here's a photo of some of the equipment I have, which came in very useful. For example, we have this fluorescence microscope here, crucial for carrying out various analyses of not only infection processes, but also some of the defense responses in turfgrass. This is a spectrophotometer, an old one, an analog spectrophotometer, but it certainly does the job. We had a centrifuge here and various bits and pieces of lab equipment to work with. And this is the famous thing which I found in what's called a head shop. Ideal tool for grinding up dried grass. Purely for laboratory work, obviously. So the thing is, right, the question is, was all this effort, worth it? Did this research have any value to anyone? Well, apparently it did. They have what's called impact case studies for universities in the UK to see how their work is actually, how effective the research they're carrying out is. And the work we did with phosphite and microdocium earned a 3-star case with national and international reach. So they determined it had very considerable impact in terms of reach and significance. And this is based on use of our findings that were published by numerous companies and end users. So that was very gratifying to see that coming through. How does all this academic study complement a position as a turfgrass manager? Sometimes, or quite often, you'd be asked that. Do you need all this academic work for your job, basically? Well, here's a few things that this education will give you. It'll give you a thorough understanding of the science involved in turfgrass and plant science in general, so that's a good thing. You'll also develop transferable and very personal skills in areas such as communication, time management, work prioritization, critical analysis and report writing. So it's not just all science research, there's a lot of extra skills you can develop by going through this process. It'll also give you the ability and give you the confidence to interact with other scientists, with agronomists, employers and your turfgrass peers. So no longer are you just kowtowing and agreeing to what people are saying. You can stand up on your own feet and you can talk back and argue and tell people that they're wrong if they're wrong. And it certainly gives you this confidence. You'll also develop methods possibly and practices which could help or influence how others manage or maintain their sports turf swards. So this is a very gratifying possibility also that something you work on will be taken up and used by other greenkeepers and turfgrass and grounds people. So was it worth all the effort and work? Well, I think so, yes. Would I recommend the pathway of academic progress to others? Yes, certainly would. Apart from, I mentioned all the positives there in the previous couple of slides, but for me it was a great personal challenge. It's very stimulating, and it will provide you with some extreme satisfaction, well, eventually. For example, here's me receiving an award of a mug from Penn State from Dr. Mike Fidanza. Might seem a small thing, but to me that meant a lot. This was a recognition for some of the research I had done, so that was a valuable moment for me, I have to say. What else has it done? Well, here's just some of the many people I've met, which I wouldn't have met only for the road to education I'd taken. You met people like Frank Rossi, Frank Wong, John Kaminsky, Tom Nicolai, some good friends here, Greg and Dave, and many greenkeepers from around the world, hundreds in fact, and I wouldn't have had this opportunity without following this road to education. It also allowed me to present my research and findings to numerous people at BTME in Harrogate, the IOG Saltex at GIS Orlando, and in countries such as Sweden, Czech Republic, Scotland, Ireland, Canada, the USA. So again, the road to education has opened up a whole realm of interests and travels for myself. There's just some of the places we've seen in our travels as well. Thanks to that, we have seen the fantastic Clifton Bridge in Bristol, Quebec, Times Square in New York, Niagara Falls, Toronto. So again, what can I say? The take-home message from today's talk, well, turfgrass management is always evolving and providing new challenges, and we have to continuously be prepared for this, and education and knowledge is crucial, is vital in fact. There's always scope for improvement and new areas to research, and if an old guy like me from the outback of Kildare in Ireland can do it, then there's absolutely nothing stopping you guys. So that's me on Twitter. I'm always there. If you want to have a chat or ask questions, feel free to follow me. And hopefully you found today's little talk of interest and not too boring, can I say. And what can I end with? Well, anyone can cut grass, sure, provided they can get it to grow in the first place.